Today we are looking at feedback. Now, feedback is part of the learning environment and is focus question 4. And feedback involves internal, external, concurrent, delayed, knowledge of results, and knowledge of performance. Now, what's really important about this dash point is that you actually look at the right-hand side and see that it is linking to the stages of skill acquisition, which we have already covered in a dot point above. What I will do is link back to the stages of skill acquisition and how feedback links into this as we go on. Now, what we've got to understand about feedback, first of all, is everybody needs feedback. When we do a performance in something such as we perform in a test or a game, without feedback and ongoing feedback, a person will not know how they actually need to improve and what they can do to do better next time. If we look at a sporting scenario, although someone might win a match, there'll be a lot of important aspects of their game, but also there will be parts that they can improve on. So feedback is actually the information provided to the learner about the nature or result of their performance. Now, feedback is essential for an athlete at any stage. If we look at the stages of acquisition and you look at the cognitive stage, the beginning stage, that athlete can actually not get to the next stage, the associative stage, without current feedback. And that will be current feedback usually from their coaches and what they can improve to get to the next stage. When someone has a lesson, say a beginner snowboarder, without feedback within the lessons and knowing and feeling what's going wrong, they will not able to improve. Feedback actually works best when it is immediate and positive, and it tends to reinforce the correct acquisition of the skills. Now, when we receive feedback, whether it be positive or negative, this can come from coaches, crowd, parents, teammates, and we can also, as we know from previous information on other dot points, we can have internal feedback. Now, why do we actually need feedback in performance? It actually does a number of things. It reinforces the desired response and understanding what that person can do to improve. It also is used for motivation. If a coach is watching a performer and they say, that was a great shot, carry on, keep going, and the reinforcement is positive, they are more likely to want to maintain and improve their skill and carry on within that coaching session. Also within feedback, when we receive it, it is correcting an action. Going back to my example of a snowboarder that's starting out in lessons, when a coach will actually say to them, you need to correct on these things such as the weight onto the board and how they are balancing, that will actually correct any errors and make sure they improve and can move on from that beginner stage. Performers can come to rely on feedback, and if it is taken away from the athlete and they're not receiving feedback in coaching sessions after games, such as video feedback, then performance will decrease. So moving on to the first type of feedback, which is internal and external feedback. Now, internal feedback is experienced during the performance of the skill, and it comes from within. It's received through the body's mechanisms of the actual senses, so they can feel when a performance or a certain skill is going right, or they can feel when a skill is going wrong. And those top athletes will actually be able to correct a skill during a performance through that feeling motion and correct it to ensure that that skill is actually successful in the end. And you have the example of a tennis player who serves the ball and knows it will hit the net as soon as they have made contact because the movement feels incorrect. External is the opposite and is actually coming from sources outside the body. Now, external feedback can come from a number of places for that athlete, usually from the coach or the crowd, Receiving an applause from the crowd will usually obviously help the performer know that they've done well, such as a serve in tennis and an ace, a score, video replays, or results. If a marathon runner comes through the finish line and then they look at the time, they're obviously going to get their race result and know if they've achieved a personal best, for example. Our next type of feedback is concurrent and delayed feedback. Now, concurrent is receiving feedback during the performance of a skill, and delayed feedback is obviously after the skill has happened, and this could be exactly after the skill, such as a coach shouting, "You've missed that shot," or it can be after the game, for example, in soccer. So concurrent is received during the performance of a skill, and it is relayed through the body by the senses. Okay, for example, a handstand, a person receives feedback from the brain which allows them to maintain balance. They feel that they might be tipping over and then they adjust their body position. Again, another example of concurrent feedback might be a basketball player going for a layup. They can feel when they're jumping through the air that they might need to make a slight adjustment to ensure that they are close to the basket and the ball goes in. Delayed feedback is receiving after the skill, as I have said, and an example of this is waiting for a result of a basketball free throw. So you've taken the shot and adjusted that body position through concurrent feedback, and the delayed is actually waiting to see if the shot goes in, or the feedback is not received until the ball enters or misses the basket. You must understand the difference here is concurrent is actually happening during the skill while it's happening, and delayed is after the skill has happened. Knowledge of results and knowledge of performance is very easy to understand. When we think of knowledge of results, it's the information about the outcome of a movement. For example, how many goals were scored from a number of attempts, winning or coming second. And this type of knowledge is always external. It always comes from an outside source. So when a gymnast does a routine, knowledge of results is waiting for the panel of judges to give them their score. Knowledge of performance is information about the actual execution of a skill. So knowledge of performance is the performer understanding how they have actually executed that skill and whether it is successful or not. Your examples in your notes are a tennis player that has gone to do a serve and they actually, their knowledge of the performance is the ball toss needs to be higher. Another example is during freestyle, a swimmer can feel that their elbow needs to be higher or that their hand needs to enter the water at a slightly different degree. Again here, linking into the previous concurrent and delayed, knowledge of results comes again from external sources. So once something has happened, and knowledge of performance is when the skill is happening and the athlete understands how they have performed at the time. These two are very similar. The last thing we need to cover within this dash point is actually how do we link feedback to the stages of skill acquisition, which is cognitive stage. Remember, that is the beginning stage where someone is a novice and they might not have ever performed the skill before. The associative stage, which is that middle stage that a lot of athletes don't actually get past. That's before we reach the elite level, which is known as the autonomous phase. Now, feedback is needed within all of these three stages of skill acquisition. However, depending on the athlete's ability will depend on the type of feedback used. You would never have an athlete that is starting out in a skill, take gymnastics for instance, that will have knowledge of performance and be able to correct their skill during the performance based on the feel of the body. So certain stages of acquisition actually link to how the learner will progress through those stages depending on the feedback. So if we look at the cognitive stage first, here, external feedback is needed, and that will always come from the coach, and they will rely on the coach for most of their feedback. Okay, it's the coach's job to tell them where they're going wrong. And remember, lots of errors are made in the cognitive stage, so it's the coach's job to correct those errors. Concurrent feedback is also the most effective when in the cognitive stage because it is ongoing. So the coach is providing ongoing feedback. If we think of a snowboarding lesson, the coach is usually with you the whole time and they're telling you how to adjust your body, and you might not be knowing internally what's going wrong, and then it's the coach's job to say, well, externally your balance is off, you need to lean forward, and the feedback is always concurrent. They might give them a little brief at the end, which will be delayed feedback, but the most effective at the cognitive stage is external and concurrent feedback. You need to be able to justify why, like I have, and give sporting examples. The associative stage, as I said, is the middle stage. And this is when an athlete has obviously learnt the skill and is trying to fine tune that skill so they can move on to the autonomous phase, which is our elite athlete. Here, feedback has to have knowledge of results. So they need to know what are their results. For instance, in basketball, how many shots are they missing each game? How many fouls have they made? How many wins have they had? How many losses? And gaining a knowledge of results will actually help them improve and move on to that elite stage. They'll have a knowledge of their performance as well. At that stage, you understand internally how you are performing and what needs to be corrected. However, you still need the coach to give concurrent feedback and ensure that they are correcting any errors that are made. The autonomous phase is the elite stage where an athlete is fine-tuning their tactics, and they're not so much focused on the skill anymore. That comes naturally. They're focusing on the tactics, and this is where feedback is essential, but it must be a different type of feedback. It will be very specific from the coach. So for instance, if a tennis player is serving, it will obviously not be focused on the skill anymore, but how to gain an ace. This is where feedback can be delayed a lot of the time. Video feedback can help an athlete understand how they performed in a game, and a coach will sit through that video and go through in very fine detail with the athlete what they did right and things that they can improve on. Again, they will have a very in-depth knowledge of performance during the autonomous stage, and this will be internal a lot of the time as well, because if an athlete, such as a tennis player, feels that they are hitting the ball wrong, they actually have the skill to be able to correct it through the actual performing of the skill, so the outcome can still be an effective one. So what we've done is looked at the different types of feedback today: internal, external, concurrent, delayed, knowledge of results and knowledge of performance. And we have also focused on the right hand side of the learn to, which is how feedback will be used as the learners progress through the stages of skill acquisition. And remember here, you need to be able to link the different types of feedback to the different stages of skill acquisition. There are 3, and give a sporting example for each.